Olaf Dragvesen was of Norway, was a Viking. He was the epitome of a Viking. He could swim faster, jump higher, fight harder, anything. He could do it as a Viking. In fact, they said that he could juggle 5 different daggers in the air at one time and yet catch them all by their handle. As a young man, he led his people, his Vikings, to invade Holland and France. And he was successful. And then he turned around and faced Britain. That was the prize to him. And of course, as he went into Britain, he was burning villages, killing people, irregard of age or gender. And he just went from one village to the next. And finally, someone stopped him and said, if you will just give up, cease, I'll give you 22,000 pounds of silver. And as that deal was being worked out, someone told him that there was a hermit who was very good with prophecy. And so he went to the hermit and asked him what his future would be. And the hermit said, well, you will become a great king and you'll do great things. But before that, you'll be wounded and your men will mutiny. In the process of their mutiny, you'll be wounded. Sure enough, that happened. There was a mutiny and he was wounded. But after he recovered, he went back to the hermit and he said to the hermit, how is it that you know my future? You know what was going to happen? He said, because the God of the Christians has given me everything I want to know. And so on that basis, he stopped everything. He went back to Norway. He became the king of Norway. And I'd love to say that everybody lived happily ever after. That's not necessarily true. But what is true is that he led many people to the Lord, and the nation of Norway became a more unified and a more Christian nation under his leadership. And for the next 1,000 years, it remained that way. Now, when we hear a story like that has that predictive element, we say, wow, man, that's really cool. That really happened? And then we think, well, yeah, it can happen. And we hear stories like that all the time. But when it comes to the Bible and the prophecies in the Bible, why is it that so many people today discount those prophecies? And they say, how can that happen? I mean, some of the things that we're going to look at today, there have been those who've said those things, that they could not have predicted those things far in advance. Surely the Bible, the dating of those books, the Bible and so forth, they must be incorrect. Well, I want to ask you a question today that kind of goes with this whole thing about the trustworthiness of God. If God is God and the Bible is His Word written through His prophets, but superintended by God, shouldn't we expect His prophets to write about the future with the same assurance as historians write about the past? Shouldn't we expect God and His prophets to write about the future with the same guarantee and assurance and confidence as historians write about the past? Equally, shouldn't we expect God's predictions to be 100% correct? And shouldn't we expect them to be with great clarity? Now, we understand many prophetic statements in the Bible are written with symbols and things of that nature, but when you get right down to it, you can understand that. You can understand each one of them because the Bible confirms one passage with another passage. The Bible interprets itself, as we have often said. One of the most famous, I don't know what you would call him, psychic prophet of the day, is of many days past perhaps, but of modern era, I guess, it was Nostradamus. And a lot of people hang their hat on what he did and said, but yet he wrote in riddle and rhymes, and in many cases didn't make sense at all. For example, it says, in the year that is to come soon, not far from Venus, the two greatest ones of Asia and Africa shall be said to come from the Rhine in Esther. Crying tears shall be at Malta and on the Italian shore. Now, if you missed seeing that was Hitler, reference to Hitler in this prophecy, then you missed the interpretation. And the scholars of Nostradamus would say that Ister is the name for Hitler. I think it's a name for a river, not for Hitler. Here's another one. The great man will be struck down in the day of a thunderbolt, the evil deed predicted by the bearer of a petition. According to the prediction, another falls at nighttime. Conflict in Rheims, London, and pestilence in Tuscany. Now, did you interpret that? Surely you saw that that's a reference to the assassination of John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, right? There are others who would say, well, it wasn't really that. This had to do with an invasion of Hitler and the division between Britain and France. Clearly, again, he spoke in rhymes and wrote in rhymes and riddle, and that was very difficult to understand. And yet the Bible writes with great clarity. Again, if God is God, can we not expect God to write about the future with the same certainty as the historians write about the past? And why is that? Because God is not just in the past, and He's not just in our present, He's in our future. Think of this, the front of this pulpit, or whatever you want to call it, as the timeline. Now, everything we do is related to time, right? What time do we get done here? What time's my appointments tomorrow? What time am I going to this place or that place? Everything's based upon time. Now, we know that God was before the foundation of the world. We also know that He is now present in our experience. What we don't realize and don't think of, He's also in our future. See, the timeline with God is just a small line in the greatness and the grandeur of the God who is all-encompassing. And so God stands in our future just as He stands in our present. That's why we can understand that God can write, and His prophets can write, with the same confidence that a historian will write about the history of the past. Now, again, today we want to answer the question, what is about prophecy that can communicate to me that we can trust the Bible? How can I know from prophecy that the Bible is trustworthy? That's what we want to look at today. And we're going to look at some prophecies in the Old Testament. Many times when people talk about prophecy, they talk about the messianic prophecies. And we're going to go to that before we leave today. But I'm going to go back to some in the Old Testament that you haven't heard perhaps, or perhaps they're remote to you in many ways. And look at just some prophecies that were given years before, and yet God brought them about. First place is the prediction concerning Edom. And that's in Jeremiah 49. The Edomites were not a very pleasant group of people. They were disliked by God because they rejoiced in the calamity of the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, the Hebrew people. And so God says, I'm going to bring judgment upon you. And in chapter 49 of Jeremiah, verses 19 and 20, it says, Behold, one will come up like a lion from the thickets of the Jordan against a perennially watered pasture. Now, take note of that, watered pasture. For in an instant I will make him run away from it, and whoever is chosen I shall appoint over it. For who is like me, and who will summon me into court? And who then is the shepherd who can stand against me? And then he goes on and says, Therefore hear the plan of the Lord, which has been planned against Edom, His purpose which He has purposed against the inhabitants of Tema. Surely they will drag them off, even the little ones of the flock. Surely he will make their pasture desolate because of them. Now, what's he talking about here? Well, Edom was a city that prided itself on its natural boundaries and natural security as far as the rocks around them. They were a city built inside rocks, and they had a narrow passageway. And not only that, as you saw about here in the text, it talked about watered pastures. And so it was a very fertile land. And yet God says there's coming a day when you will not exist. What happened here? Well, keep in mind that Jeremiah prophesied between the year 627 and 586 BC. And so, did this happen? The prophecy again, remember, somewhere between 627 BC and 586 BC. Did this happen? Well, it did. But it happened during the intertestamental period. You say, what is that? That's the period that begins at the end of the writing of the Old Testament and before the events that brought in the New Testament. 400 years time period, in which God said nothing. They called them the silent years. God gave no new revelation, said nothing, did nothing. It was just those 400 years of silence. But it was during that time that desert tribes, who called themselves the Nabateans, drove the Edomites from their land. They went and migrated to South Judah, and there they had their names changed. They actually were referred to by their Greek names. The Edomians, which again was a Greek name. And there, in that place, in 125 BC, a man by the name of John Hyrcanus, who was a Maccabean, Hyrcanus the first, I should say, who was a Maccabean, subjugated these people and basically made them take on Judaism. But they, as a nation, ceased to exist. As a group of people, national people, ceased to exist. And you know why? Because unlike Moab, unlike Ammon, unlike Egypt, they were never promised a restoration. The other nations were, but they were not. There's a man, a physicist by the name of Hugh Ross, who has put some mathematical probabilities to some of the things that we'll be sharing today. And he said, for all of this to happen concerning Edom would be 1 in 10 to the 5th power. What that means is you take that 1 and add 5 zeros to it, and you have the answer. So it's 1 in 100,000 is the mathematical probability of that event occurring. The next one is the prophecy concerning Tyre that we read earlier. The city of Tyre demise is recorded by historians who tell you about Alexander the Great, who sieged the city. But before that, there was another person who was supposed to do that, who was supposed to come and destroy the city and kill all the people, and that was Nebuchadnezzar. His efforts, though, were not complete. And so here's the background. Ezra prophesied that God would raise up Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and that he would go and destroy the city. In fact, let's go to Ezekiel chapter 26. That was read earlier. And let's just pick up just a few verses, not all of them, but just a few verses. Beginning in verse 4, it says, "They will destroy the walls of Tyre, break down her towers, and I will scrape her debris from her and make her a bare rock. She will be a place for the spreading of nets in the midst of the sea, for I have spoken, declares the Lord God, and she will become spoil for the nations. And her daughters who are on the mainland will be slain by the sword, and they will know that I am the Lord." Now, in the next verse, it tells us who that person is that's supposed to do this, at least in part, and it is Nebuchadnezzar. Now, go over to verse 12. It says, and they will make a spoil of your riches and a prey of your merchandise, break down your walls and destroy your pleasant houses, and throw your stones and your timbers and your debris into the water. In verse 14, and I will make you a bare rock, and you will be a place for the spreading of nets. So what all does he say here is going to happen to the city of Tyre? Well, first, Nebuchadnezzar will destroy the city of Tyre. Many nations will come against Tyre. Tyre will become bare like the top of a flat rock. Fishermen will spread their nets over the site. Tyre will be thrown into the water and never be rebuilt. Now, how did all this come about? Well, what you have to understand is that Tyre had two parts. It had a city on the coastline, and then 1/2 mile out from the coastline was an island, and it too was a part of the city of Tyre. Now, Nebuchadnezzar came and besieged the city. He had defeated, after 585 BC, after defeating Jerusalem, he moved on Tyre. And for 13 years he spent trying to besiege this city. And finally he did that, at least in part. He didn't kill all the people. All the people migrated to the island, but he didn't complete the job. So for 240 years, Tyre, as an island, a city, thrived. And people perhaps begin to ask the question, well, is Ezekiel's prophecy false? Is it flawed? Is it inadequate? Until a general showed up on the scene named Alexander. We know him as Alexander the Great. Alexander is marching. He just defeated the Persians. He's marching down the coastline. He's gone through Palestine. And he realizes that for him to continue on to Egypt, it would be a mistake to leave Tyre thriving in his back, in his rearview mirror, because certainly they could perhaps, with Egypt, gang up against them, against him and his army. So the first thing he said to the people on the island, he said, let us come, let me come with my men and onto your island, and so that we can worship your god Hercules as well with you. Well, they weren't stupid. They knew that he was up to no good. And so they said no. And so Alexander said, somehow then I've got to take this island. But the problem was they tried to take the island. Every time they would try to hit the island, their men would be faced with large rocks coming down in their face and on their heads from these high walls. And so at that point, Alexander thought, what am I going to do? And then he came up with this genius idea. Now remember, Nebuchadnezzar basically destroyed the city on the coastline. And all the people migrated to the island. And so Alexander came up with the idea that they would build a causeway from the rubble and the destruction of the city on the coastline. 1/2 mile to the island, 200 feet wide, this causeway built by the rubble of the city. Not only that, but he also was able to marshal 220 ships that would come with him to help him conquer this city. You say, where did he get the ships? Well, remember one of the prophecies? It said many nations would come against you. When Nebuchadnezzar took the city on the coastline, it was only one nation, Babylon. Now, there are many nations that Alexander was able to pull together this navy that would attack this city. And after 3 years, he was successful. Tyre lost 8,000 soldiers. Another 2,000 soldiers were crucified around about the city, and 30,000 women and children were sold into slavery. It all came about. Remember what Ezekiel said in verse 14? You will be made as a bare rock, and for the spreading of nets by fishermen. Arthur Hustance is a Canadian anthropologist, and he said this: how unlikely it all was. What kind of human foresight would have enabled a man to foresee that a thriving city stretching for 20 miles along the shore, of which 7 miles were densely populated and built up with large buildings, would one day be desolate and then laid in the midst of the sea, even its very dust. But it all came to pass. Why? Because God said so. Here's another one. It's a prediction of Cyrus. How would you like to predict who would be the president of the United States 150 years from now? And how would you like to predict exactly what would be his greatest foreign and domestic act of policy? You say, well, I don't care. I won't be here in 150 years, right? But that's exactly what God did with King Cyrus. 150 years before it all transpired, Isaiah predicted that Babylon would conquer Jerusalem, but also that Persia would conquer Babylon. Isaiah said that Persia would become a world power, and no one at that moment, at that time when the prediction was made, would have thought that Persia would have been a great power. They hardly existed. And here's the kicker. Isaiah, speaking for God, actually named the name of the king who would bring all of this about many years before. In Isaiah 44, let's go there. In Isaiah 44, verse 26, it says, confirming the word of his servants and performing the purpose of his messenger, it is I who says of Jerusalem shall be inhabited, in the cities of Judah they shall be built, and I will raise up her ruins again. And in verse 28, it is I who says Cyrus, he is my shepherd. He will perform all my desires, and he declares of Jerusalem, she will be built. And of the temple, your foundation will be laid. Now, everyone agrees that Cyrus served over Persia from 559 BC to 530 BC. Historians also agree that the decree that allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem was in March of 538 BC. Now, keep in mind that Isaiah prophesied between 700 and 680 BC. My math tells me, I'm not a math scholar, but my math tells me that is 100 years before this man is born and 150 years before he takes over reign, 140 to 150 years before he takes over the reign of this nation. Jeremiah prophesied from 626 to 586 BC. And he predicted that the captivity of the Jews would be for 70 years, and then they would go back to their homeland. And so in accordance with this prophecy and all these prophecies, you have to go to Ezra. And Ezra says this: now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing. Many, many years before this ever came about, that the people of Israel would be set free from captivity and they would be allowed to go back to their homeland. And in fact, the king who would do this would be King Cyrus. Who could do that? Only God. Why? Because God is not just in our present experience, He's in our future. probably perhaps the most profound, the most mind-boggling, eye-popping, mind-blowing prophecy in all of the Old Testament is found in, or prophecies, I should say, are found in the book of Daniel, because it's not just one, many. In fact, some scholars have said that in just Daniel chapter 11, there are 136 prophecies. Just Daniel 11. I don't know about 136, but there are a ton that are there. What makes Daniel's prophecies so profound is that God gave Nebuchadnezzar a dream. And Daniel not only gave him the interpretation of the dream, Daniel told him what he had dreamed. So God gave it to Daniel as well. And in chapter 2 of Daniel, Daniel gives the interpretation. And what's profound there is that he speaks of 4 nations. Now, he's standing right in the midst of one, the Babylonian nation. But there are 3 others that are mentioned. And by the way, there is no Old Testament book that has come under more criticism than the book of Daniel. Why? Because there are those who say there's no way that the book of Daniel could have been written in 537 BC with everything that Daniel prophesies. Surely it must have been written much later so that he could know these kingdoms. Not so. In Daniel chapter 2, he speaks of this big image. And he talks about this image of this big giant man. And in chapter 2 of Daniel, let's go there. Beginning verse 37, Daniel here is giving the interpretation. He says, "You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory, and wherever the sons of men dwell, and the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand and has caused you to rule over them. You are the head of gold." And then in verse 39 it says, "After you there will arise another kingdom, inferior to you, then another 3rd kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. And then the 4th kingdom, there will be a 4th kingdom as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things. So like iron, this breaks in pieces, and it will crush and break all these in pieces." Now, you say, well, how do we know what those kingdoms are? Some people say you're only speculating. Chapter 7, the kingdoms are referred to as a beast, or different beasts, funny-looking beasts. But in chapter 8, their names are mentioned. Jerry, put up that diagram, if you will. The first kingdom that's mentioned, of course, is Babylon. Babylon, of course, existed between 606 and 539 BC. Daniel, the writing of Daniel, was written 537 BC. Now, the next kingdom that followed was the Medo-Persian kingdom. That was 539 to 331 BC. And then there was the Grecian kingdom, 331 to 30 BC. And then the last, the strong, the one that crushes, is Rome, the Roman kingdom, 30 BC to 397 AD. Now, what's really impressive about this it's impressive enough, right, that he could name these kingdoms. But what's even really impressive, to me at least, is that God gave Daniel clarity and a description of a man who would become out of the Grecian kingdom, who would lead the Grecian kingdom, in fact. That, again, is the man Alexander the Great. Go with me to Daniel chapter 11. And if you just want to read for the data projector, we have it there as well. Daniel chapter 11, verse 3, it says, "A mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he has risen, his kingdom will be broken up. Now, Alexander, we know, was very young when he died, right? And we also know that when Alexander died, he didn't give his kingdom over to any of his relatives. His kingdom was divided by 4 generals, his 4 prominent generals. Says, but as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up, parceled out towards the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, not according to his authority which he wield, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. If you go back to chapter 8, it talks about the horn that came up, and then it talks about the horn that was broken off, and then there's 4 horns that came after that. That is a reference to Alexander the Great. And what is even more, I think, incredible is that in chapter 11 of Daniel, there's a reference to another king who will come out of the Seleucid kingdom. That other ruler was one who's known as Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes is significant because he is a foreshadow of the Antichrist. And the things that are mentioned about Antiochus in chapter 11, beginning in verse 21, going through verse 35, all came true during his reign. For example, he turned on Israel. First, he rose with intrigue, it says, and then he turned on Israel. Well, what will the Antichrist do? He will sign a covenant with Israel, and then he'll turn his back on Israel in the middle of the week. Antiochus also will declare that the Mosaic ceremonies with their sacrifices are no longer legal and lawful. He erected a statue of Zeus in the temple. And this is perhaps the worst. He killed a sow in the temple, thus desecrating the temple. You see, he was the first, the beginning, if you will, of that thing that occurs, that's found in Matthew 24, that says will happen right in the middle of the tribulation. It's called the abomination of desecration. That is when the Antichrist will stand up. He'll put a statue, in fact, in the temple. He'll say, all bets are off. Now I am to be worshipped. And he stands in the temple and he desecrates the temple. Antiochus Epiphanes is a picture, foreshadow of the Antichrist who is to come. God laid all this out hundreds of years before they ever occurred. Amazing. Absolutely amazing to me. Now, let's get to the messianic prophecies. And we're not going to spend a lot of time here. God predicted many details concerning the Messiah when he would come so that the people would understand his identity. So there would be no mistake concerning his identity. There's a story that we get out of the files of the CIA of a Russian double agent who fled to Mexico. And there he was to meet the secretary of the ambassador of Russia to get a passport. And they told him, these are 5 things that you need to do and so that your identity will be unmistaken. 1, when in Mexico, the spy was to write a letter to the secretary signing his name as I. Jackson. 2, after 3 days, he was to go to the Plaza de Colón, or Colón, depending on how you want to pronounce that name, in Mexico City. He was to stand before the statue of Columbus with his middle finger placed into a guidebook. 4, when he was approached, he was to say that it was a magnificent statue and that he was from Oklahoma. And 5, the secretary at that point would give him the passport. Now, those are 5 things that were to occur, 4 to 5 things that were to occur that would identify this double agent. With Christ, there weren't 5 distinct marks. There weren't even 8 or 10, or close to 300 messianic statements about Christ. I want us just to look at just a few. First, the one that we all know about is the fact that some 400 years, I should say approximately 700 years, 700 BC, the prophet Micah named the tiny village of Bethlehem as a place where Christ would be born. Now, some have said before, without really reading the Bible, they say, well, there were plenty of Bethlehems in Palestine, in the land of Palestine during this day, right? I was born in the city, my wife was also born in that same city, named Jackson. You know how many Jacksons there are in the nation? Just about every state has a Jackson. God made sure there would be no mistake. He named also the state, Bethlehem Ephratah, the place, the province. 2, and by the way, the probability of that happening, 1 in 10 to the 5th power again. 2, the prediction concerning Christ's crucifixion. We're talking about the mode of crucifixion here. Some 400 years before the crucifixion was invented, both Israel's King David and the prophet Zechariah described the Messiah's mode of death. Described his mode of death as crucifixion. For example, in Psalm 22, Psalm 22, verse 14 through 16, it says, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws, and you lay me in the dust of death. For dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced, now watch this, they pierced my hand and my feet. Now when Isaiah prophesied often, he would speak of something in the present, but he would tie it in picture form or in what we call typology, in terms of a shadow or a silhouette of something that is to come. And that is exactly what he was doing here. It's also what Zechariah did as well. In Psalm 34, it speaks of the fact that even his bones were not broken. Part of the crucifixion, as many of you know, was that in order to keep someone from breathing on the cross, they would break their leg. Why? Because in order to breathe on the cross, you had to push yourself upward in order to move the organs inside of you. And so they would break their leg. With Jesus, they didn't break his leg because he was already dead. That was even prophesied many, many years before. The probability of that occurring, 1 in 10 to the 13th power. You say, what do you mean 13th power? That means at that one, add 13 zeros to it, and you've got the number. Let me give you one more. The prediction concerning Christ's death, and this goes back to the book of Daniel. Some time before 500 BC, the prophet Daniel proclaimed that Israel's long-awaited Messiah would be in public ministry, and that it would be 483 years from the time that the decree to restore the city of Jerusalem, not the temple in Jerusalem, but the city of Jerusalem, that it would be 483 years. And then it says at the end of those 483 years, the Messiah would be cut off. Messiah would come, and then he would be cut off. What's that mean? It means that you'd be crucified. Scholars have calculated that from that signing of that decree, putting that decree into motion, 483 years carries you right up to the day of Christ's triumphant entry into Jerusalem. Amazing. Amazing. It says 69 weeks. 69 weeks in that passage speaks of years. Weeks of years. You see, what I've given you are just 3 prophecies concerning the Messiah. For Christ to do just 8, the probability of that of 8 prophecies being fulfilled in one person would be 1 in 10 to the 17th power. Add 17 zeros after 1, and you have it. Almost inconceivable, impossible. So can we trust the Bible? I'd say that prophecy by itself tells us that we can trust the Bible. Who else could know this? Because it affirms the fact that we have a God who's alive, and a God who's not just in our past and not just in our present moment, but He's in our future. And God stands not at the end looking down. God stands in the future looking back. And He's saying, I'm orchestrating everything according to my timetable. I'm superintending everything that's going to happen. So, what does that say to me and to you? It means that God is in your future. He's in control of your future. You may not make sense of it right now, this moment, but He's already there. He's already there in your future.